we look at the book of Joshua, we look at the context and history of that, we look at the evidence that demonstrates its truth, and showing us that therefore we can take what is said in the book of Joshua as your truth and as useful instruction and application. I just pray that you would help us to understand your word and apply it and see what's been left behind, what's been rediscovered, the value of that in the study of your word and in the demonstration of its truth. In Christ's name, amen. Yeah. So Pastor Jeremy has been teaching through the framework, going through these different historical periods and events of the Bible, and you are almost in the book of Joshua. And so before he gets to teaching on the book of Joshua, I'm going to teach on the archaeology and the historical context of the book of Joshua. Not just the things that have been found which demonstrate the accuracy of the book of Joshua, that it's really history. It's not just spiritual fables, but also the context and a better idea of what was going on in the world at that time, so that when you're reading through this book and you're studying it, you can visualize some of what is written in the pages better. You can understand the cultural and historical background and have a fuller understanding of the scripture. There's some very difficult passages, obviously, in the book of Joshua, in that narrative story, but if we understand the background of it, it really helps us to comprehend the reasons why these things happened, and gives us a more realistic picture of that time period of Canaan, of Israel, not sort of this sterilized storybook version that we might get from just glancing through the text. So first of all, Canaan in the ancient world. Here we have the approximate boundaries of the land of Canaan. So you can see that in the context of the ancient Near East. It's a pretty small area in comparison to places like Egypt, the kingdom of Egypt, or Mesopotamia, Babylon, for example, or Assyria. But it's also important to understand that Canaan was not a nation. Canaan was a region. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that to give you historical context. That's something that's important in terms of the conquest narrative, the Joshua narrative. So here's a close-up of Canaan. And again, some of these cities you're probably familiar with. Jerusalem, of course, Gaza here, Megiddo, Hatzor, important city. Some of you may or may not know of it, but Sidon and Tyre, Damascus, that was all in the sphere of the region of Canaan, all right? Again, not a nation. The total population, we could estimate it at about 600,000 at the time of Joshua, and the largest city here, Hatzor, had about 45,000 people within the walls, all right? Just some background context there. The time period that we're talking about is also important. How do we get to a place where we can say that the conquest under Joshua happened around 1400 BC? We're able to do that because the Bible gives us detailed records about chronology. The writers of the different books of the Bible want us to know exactly when these events happen. They're setting it in reality, and they're allowing us also to go back and check the accuracy of their writing. The authors of Exodus and Joshua and Kings and so forth could have just said a long time ago in this place and been unspecific. But they get down to these very, very detailed numbers. For example, one of the primary passages relating to this Exodus conquest time period comes from 1 Kings 6:1. And it says, "In the 480th year after the Israelites came up out of Egypt, in the 4th year of King Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv," which is the second month, "he began to build the temple of Yahweh." So he gives us the exact number of years and all these things that connect to that. And because we know when Solomon reigned, we are able to then project back to the Exodus and then to the conquest. I've put several references here that allow us to specify a conquest date of about 1400 BC. Numbers 10 and Numbers 14 both talk about the wandering. 1 Kings 6, the time back to the Exodus. Joshua 14:10 and Judges 11:26 also factor into this. Joshua, in terms of the number of years that they were fighting as this unified army, and then Judges 11:26 is another confirmation of this approximate time, saying Israel had been in the land already 300 years in the time of Jephthah. So we have that very specific information, and then that allows us to look at history outside the source of the Bible and in archaeology also to see what connects with that specific time period. So, in the 1400s BC, Canaan, again, not a nation, it's a region, but it was divided into city-states, similar to classical period Greece. So a city, there's a major city, and it had its own king, and he was ruling over that city and over some smaller towns and villages in the area, kind of his sphere of influence. But you would go several miles over in another direction, and you might run into another city that had a different king. Sometimes they were at peace with each other, sometimes they were at war with each other. So they were not a big happy family. The Canaanites didn't always get along. In fact, they were often fighting each other. We do see that many of them unify against the Israelites. And in some ways, it may have been historic allies. In other situations is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So they would rather have Canaanites as their neighbors than the Israelites coming in, and so they allied with their Canaanite neighbors. The cities were ruled by these kings or mayors, sometimes they're called in other sources, but the Egyptians also exerted a lot of influence over Canaan, or they had in the past. And this goes back especially to the time of Pharaoh Thutmose III, who Moses knew. Moses probably grew up with him. And he had conquered much of Canaan and subjugated it. But of course, by the time of the conquest, the Egyptians are almost completely absent from Canaan because their country has been crippled. And again, you read through the book of Joshua, you don't see them interacting with Egyptian military there because the Egyptian military had been crushed and Egypt internalized at this point. And we're going to look at some of the Canaanite documents that actually help to demonstrate that also. So Joshua brings the Israelites into Canaan around 1400 BC because they've got to kick the Canaanites out of there. They were promised this land, but there are other people living there, and there are other people living there who are living horrible lives, doing terrible things. We're going to look at some of the beliefs and practices of the Canaanites, which are also talked about in Joshua, in Deuteronomy, and Judges, and so on. But we have evidence of that in archaeology too. So they conquer the land. Chapters 1 through 11, we see narratives about battles and so forth. Chapter 12 is this summary in which it lists all of the city-states and the kings that the Israelites defeat. And then 13 through 24, we have the land divided amongst the tribes and this speech at the end. Now, although under Joshua, Israel did conquer much of the land of Canaan, they didn't 100% complete the conquest. So there are some places like Beit Shean, which is up near the Sea of Galilee, or Megiddo, Jaffa on the coast, Gaza on the coast, that the Israelites did not initially conquer under Joshua. And actually, some of these were Egyptian strongholds still, where they had an Egyptian official, maybe some troops had been left over there from many years before. But some of the places the Israelites didn't immediately take over. Some places like Megiddo they actually defeated, but they didn't immediately settle those. But what happened is exactly what Moses talked about earlier, is that these remaining pagan areas became a source of spiritual testing and difficulty. Because essentially, the practices and beliefs of the Canaanites, they were going to infect the Israelites. They had a very strong negative influence on them in some areas. Here's a map of the tribal lands, so you can get an idea of that. Again, you can see how this does not match up to the modern state of Israel, because this is the land that was delegated to the sons of Jacob. You see, it stretches over into what is now Jordan and some of Lebanon and Syria. All right? And it doesn't go quite as far south as the modern day. But you can see Benjamin, Judah, Simeon here in the south, and then all these northern tribes, of course. But remember, they did settle on the eastern side of the Jordan River, and that, according to the Canaanites, they considered that also part of their land. In general terms, we can say that the vast majority of cities and towns that are talked about in the book of Joshua and even Judges, but we're focusing on Joshua, these are known from Canaanite and Egyptian documents from this late Bronze Age period. This is approximately the time of Moses, Joshua, and the Judges. They're known from sources, ancient sources outside of the Bible. So Joshua, the book of Joshua, didn't just make up the names of these towns. They were real places. We know about them from the writings of people like the Canaanites and the Egyptians. They also, many of them, most of them even, have been discovered archaeologically. That is, we know where these places are located. In some cases, the towns, the cities have been excavated. In others, we found remains that are still visible on the surface, but they haven't been dug up, but we at least know they were there, they existed at the time of Joshua. I mentioned earlier, there's no sign of Egypt fighting Joshua at this time, right? And that's also reflected in what's called the Amarna letters. We're going to look at a few of those. But this was a source, Canaanites writing letters to the Egyptian Pharaoh. In many cases, they ask for help, but it never comes. So Egypt did not send troops, and they apparently could not send troops. Baal, or Baal-Hadad, was the main god of the Canaanites at this time. We see that word or that title many, many times in the Old Testament, including the writings of Moses and Joshua and Judges. So this is a Canaanite word for master or lord, and in fact, sometimes it's even used like that in Hebrew, but most of the time it's talking about this chief god or a major god. And it's referring to the Canaanites' primary god, the weather god, Baal-Hadad. So on the left, there's a stele showing this god from Ugarit, which is in Syria today, kind of northern Canaan, or you might even say this was a little bit outside of the Canaan region, but they had the same culture, more or less. And on the right, this is a figurine of the same god, and this one's actually from Canaan. Many of these have been found. So they had a lot of these smaller idols that were about that big, made out of metal, sometimes stone, but often metal. And then they did have some larger ones, stone ones that, one of the biggest ones we found when it was intact probably came to about that height. The main goddess was Astarte, or Ashtaroth. as it's sometimes rendered, like in Judges chapter 2, verse 13. So that was the main goddess. Baal-Hadad was the main god. She was associated with fertility. The Canaanite pantheon, their gods and goddesses, you can usually count on one of their deities being associated with some type of violence and some type of fertility, or even both. They were very into both of those things, violence and fertility. Here's an example of a Canaanite religious installation. So this was moved from the remains of a temple, a Canaanite temple at Hatzor. So you can see how they set up all these standing stones. If you go back to Exodus, Moses talks about this command that they have been given to break their sacred standing stones in pieces. So he's referring to these types of things. Most of those you see, they're blank. I mean, they've intentionally shaped them in this way, but most of them are blank. The one in the middle, you can see the hands that are being raised to that crescent moon and either a sun disk or a moon in there. The Canaanites didn't decorate these for whatever reason very often, but they made a whole lot of them. These are found at sites all over the place, these standing stones. Then there's an offering pillar, there's an idol on the left, and then there's an animal figurine that was probably part of the entrance decoration. Deuteronomy also says, "You shall not set up for yourself a sacred pillar." So they weren't supposed to make these, and the ones that they found, they were supposed to destroy. We'll see some evidence of that happening also. Now that's obviously part of Canaanite religion, but the Canaanites' religion permeated their entire worldview and society. It's not like people try to make things today in the West, where they try to put religion here, and then regular life here, and then politics here. It was all connected there. Their king was connected to their religion, their everyday life. All the things were connected to their religion. And what are some of the things that they did, particularly the things that we would find very disturbing and that go against specific commands of God found in the Bible? Well, one very well known or talked about thing is human sacrifice. For example, in Leviticus 18:21, here's the commandment: "You shall not give any of your offspring to offer them to Moloch." Why would he say that? Because people were doing that, because Moloch was a god that the Canaanites worshipped. And this is what they did at times. They would offer their children to Moloch. Another one: "Any man from the sons of Israel or from the aliens sojourning in Israel who gives any of his offspring to Moloch shall surely be put to death." Leviticus 22-5. Now this was not just simply, here I'm dedicating my child to you and he's going to worship you or serve you or be a priest or something like that. It wasn't even as nonchalant as that. It was, they were sacrificing many of their children to this god, killing the children in the sacrifice. Deuteronomy says, in Deuteronomy 12:31, they even burn their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods. All right? This is something that we see talked about quite a bit in the writings of Moses especially. And this is something that has raised a lot of debate in archaeology and history, because some people are trying to say, oh, the Bible's just trying to make the Canaanites sound really bad, so it's okay that the Israelites came in and took over that land. And other people are saying, no, we actually have evidence that they did these kinds of things. Whatever your views are as far as the theology of the Bible, it's still a historical, archaeological fact, and that was part of the Canaanites' culture. So again, there's an attempt at some sort of sanitizing the Canaanites to try to make them look like these nice, normal people, when in fact they were not at all like that. Deuteronomy 18:10, again, making his son or daughter pass through the fire. So Moses is telling them, don't do these things that the people around you are doing. Here's a passage from Ugarit. Again, this is a Canaanite, generally Canaanite cultural city. We might not put it in Canaan proper, but they're very close. They have the same beliefs in gods. This is from the 13th century BC, so just after the time of Joshua and the early Judges period. And it's talking about if an enemy force attacks your city, here is a prescription to solve it. So they're praying to Baal. It says, "O Baal, drive away the enemy force from our gates, the aggressor from our walls." And then it says, "We shall sacrifice a bull to thee, O Baal, a votive pledge we shall fulfill." And then what else? "A firstborn offspring, Baal, we shall sacrifice, a child we shall fulfill as a votive pledge." So they weren't just sacrificing animals. They would also sacrifice humans, including children, in these dire situations when they thought they really needed the help of their God. That's from their own documents. Now, there have been cemeteries discovered with evidence of this burning children to these gods like Moloch. For example, at Carthage is the most famous one. There's this massive cemetery. All of these urns, like you see there, you open them up, and there are bones of infants and children in there that have been burned. And this is probably took place over many, many, many years, and they just kept reusing this cemetery. Now, why is the Carthage one important, though? Because if you know geography and history, Carthage, that's in North Africa. But what you might not realize is that the Carthaginians were Canaanites. So what happens is they're living in Canaan. The Israelites are in Egypt. Israel comes back to Canaan, takes over the land. A lot of the Canaanites get killed or get pushed out. Many of them, they end up going north to essentially what's Lebanon today. So think of Sidon and Tyre and so forth. And then that becomes what's known as Phoenicia, the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians are Canaanites. Phoenician is just the Greek word for Canaanite. So it's the same people, just different language. And usually Phoenician is used to talk about the Canaanites in a later period, the Iron Age, we'd call it. Essentially, that's from the Judges through the kingdom period of Israel. And then what happens is they start moving, migrating, and establishing colonies. And their main one was Carthage. That was their capital of their colony over there. But they're continuing all the same beliefs and practices in Carthage that they were in Canaan 1,000 years before. And when the Greeks and the Romans witness them, they talk about the Carthaginians and this horrible things that they're doing, sacrificing their children to their gods. And so it's just a long continuation of that. At the bottom there, you see this artwork, and it's an illustration of a Canaanite god about to eat a baby. So he's got one in the bowl there. This is, again, we would call this Phoenician. So it's not the Joshua time period Canaanites, it's the later ones. This comes from southern Spain, which is another place that the Canaanites established colonies later. So they just kept bringing this stuff with them when they moved. At the Amman Airport Temple, okay, Amman, Jordan, that's where it is. This one is actually from the time of Joshua, and there's a big altar there, and when it was excavated, they found all these human bones that had been burned. And it was people of various ages, okay? So we know that they did human sacrifice on these altars, and it wasn't just children that they were doing, or infants. It was also adults, too. There's another stele called the Stele of Kapara. It talks about burning his sons before Adad. Adad is Hadad, it's Baal. Okay? It's a very similar thing that we saw with that passage from Ugarit about sacrificing the child on the wall. There's that famous passage about the Moabite king sacrificing his son on the wall to kind of get the gods on their side and inspire his troops to fight the Israelites. A lot of excavations of cities, towns, villages in Canaan from the time of Joshua have found buried underneath the floor of these houses jars with the bones of infants or young children in them that they seem to have used to dedicate to one of their gods. And then they would bury them under the house, some kind of religious ritual. Okay, this was not a normal, my child died and I'm going to bury it in the cemetery. There is a very specific reason why they put the remains in a jar and put it under their house, like some kind of talisman. What else did they do? Divination, that is things like cutting open an animal and looking at its entrails and then trying to predict the future from the way that the liver looked. Obviously, you read the Mosaic Law, this is forbidden. Witchcraft, necromancy, worship of demons, this concept of divine marriage. You see a lot of this whole fertility, sexuality with the gods and humans in ancient mythology, including in the Canaanites' documents. Ritual prostitution. These priests and priestesses that were basically prostitutes connected to the temples. Bible talks about that. It calls the male ones dogs, if you've encountered that in your reading. Bestiality present too. Although we don't have artwork that's been found from the Canaanites showing this, we do have some from later periods. You might be familiar with the Greeks. I mean, they depicted a lot of this, the ancient Greeks. It's something that's very common in ancient polytheism. And then, as I mentioned before, constant warfare between city-states. They were not all friendly, getting along. They were killing each other all the time. So one of the most heinous cultures in the ancient world. The Canaanites were not just nice, normal people. Here's an illustration of sacrificing a child on the wall. This is from the 13th century BC. So again, this late Bronze Age, just after the time of Joshua. This is actually an Egyptian drawing. So they inscribed this on a wall. They're showing the Egyptians taking over a Canaanite city. On the left, you can see the actual wall, and on the right, you can see a drawing of it. It's a little bit clearer. But if you look, you can see here, here's a child about to be sacrificed on the wall on both sides there. They're either going to drop them down or they're just hanging them. And you see how this is connected to the religion. Here's an incense censer. So they're all got their hands up in prayer to Baal or whichever god they're deciding to sacrifice to here. Because the Egyptians are storming their city and they want their god to help them, and they think this is what's going to help them. If we warped ahead in time and went to the Western Hemisphere, we see some similar practices too, like the Aztecs and the Mayans. The Mayans at the end of their civilization, they were in this massive drought. They couldn't grow any crops. And their solution to that was human sacrifice again and again and again and again. And by the time that the conquistadors got there, they had essentially destroyed their own civilization. So they were pretty easy for the Spanish to take over. But this seems to be something that people did throughout the ancient world. It wasn't just specific to the Canaanites, but if we do look in the context of the ancient Near East, the Canaanites were much worse than people like the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians. Talking about divination, Balaam, that was originally his job. Balaam ended up blessing Israel, right? But that wasn't what he was normally engaged in. That wasn't what he was hired to do. He was a seer who practiced divination, and he was supposed to actually curse the Israelites using the power of these pagan gods to do so. And I mentioned Balaam because it's in this same time period, and Joshua encountered him. But also, we have a text, an Aramaic text from the 9th century BC, found in Jordan, which is where Balaam was at that time and where the Israelites were at that time, that actually mentions Balaam, the son of Beor, a seer of the gods. So he was pretty famous enough that the people in present-day Jordan, the Ammonites, that they were actually writing about him. The Israelites, What about some evidence of them? We're going to get into some of the cities that they conquered, but first I want to talk about what are written sources or inscriptions and artwork that show the Israelites at the time of Joshua and the conquest. And the first one, the earliest one, is the Nomads of Yahweh inscription. Now, this was on a temple in southern Egypt. Today it's northern Sudan. And this comes from the time of Joshua, about 1400 BC, basically the end of the wandering period, or right as they're about to start the conquest. And the Egyptians are talking about all these different people that the Pharaoh has supposedly subjugated and defeated, places that are under his control that are not Egyptian. And in one section of this list, you have all these nomads that are associated with a particular place or a particular god or leader. And one of those is the nomads of Yahweh. That is the nomads that worship Yahweh. And how do we know that these are the Israelites? I think we can say that because the Israelites are the only people in the ancient world who are ever associated with Yahweh. Nobody else was worshiping Yahweh. If you were going to worship Yahweh, you joined the community of Israel and became an Israelite. You didn't worship Yahweh and stay living in Egypt as an Egyptian. That just wouldn't work for you. But this is the earliest inscription that's ever been found mentioning Yahweh. It appears on an Egyptian temple from the time of the wandering. Very important, showing that the Egyptians were familiar with the Israelites and with the name Yahweh. And that was one of the objects of the plague, was to demonstrate that Yahweh was real and that he was the God of Israel. It says in Exodus 7:5, the Egyptians will know that I am Yahweh. That's in that plagues narrative there. But this also shows us that it's archaeological evidence that the Israelites were wandering east of Egypt. And then we're going to see some other evidence that demonstrates their arrival in Canaan and their conquest of Canaan. The Amarna letters, I mentioned before, these documents, these letters that are being written from the Canaanites to the Egyptian Pharaoh. There are about 382 of them that have been recovered so far. I'm just going to read sections from a few that are important for our purposes today and to illustrate this, but here's one from the king of Jerusalem. It says, "The war against me is severe. Habiru have plundered all the lands of the king. If there are no archers, lost are the lands of the king." So what's happening? The Canaanite king of Jerusalem is saying, there's a war. There are these people, he's calling them the Habiru, that are taking over places in Canaan, and he needs the Egyptians to send troops in order to stop them. But these troops never actually come. You read through the whole letters, they just keep asking and asking, nothing ever comes. Joshua 10, 1-4, the Israelites encounter the king of Jerusalem. Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had captured Ai. And then there's this confederation. We have the king of Hebron and the king of Yarmouth and the king of Lachish and the king of Eglon. So they're all going to fight Israel. Then we have another one of these letters. It says, the land of the king is lost. The Habiru have taken the very cities of the king. And another one, the land of the king deserted to the Habiru. And we could go on and on like this. There are several of these letters that talk about the Habiru taking over these specific cities that are actually also mentioned in Joshua as being conquered by the Israelites. And this is at exactly the same time. This is right at about 1400 BC. Here's an Egyptian papyrus that seems to mention the tribe of Asher. This is in the 13th century BC. Again, we looked at those tribal territories. Asher was up in the north there. They had their land. They would have had a leader of the tribe. Think about the Judges period. You had more local leaders. There's also 2 Ugaritic tablets. We saw the one that talked about sacrificing the child on the wall. There's a couple Ugaritic tablets that mention the name Israel. It's probably mentioning the Israelites because we don't know what else to associate that with. We look through history, There's nothing else to associate it with. There's not information about the context of that and why they're saying it, but the name does appear. Probably the most famous, though, is the Merneptah stele. This comes from the 13th century BC, again, the time of the judges. And it was commissioned by this pharaoh, Merneptah. And he specifically mentions Israel as a people. And the way in which they are mentioned, they're the most prominent people in Canaan at that time. This is a zoom in on the part of the inscription that has Israel. So it's read from right to left in Egyptian hieroglyphs. It has Israel, and then it has what's called a determinative that shows that it's talking about a group of people. It's not a geographic area, it's not a city, it's not a god, it's not somebody's personal name. They're saying it's the people Israel. It has a man and a woman with the plural sign under it. So it's very clear this is the Israelites. And the context of it in this section of the inscription is that Merneptah says he goes into the land of Canaan, and then he says he fought against these three cities. And that's Yanoam, Gezer, and Ashkelon. And these three cities are north, central, and south. So he's kind of saying, like, I conquered these different areas. And then he says that he destroyed the seed of Israel, the grain of Israel. So he doesn't mention Canaanites or Philistines or anything like that. So he just targets the main people who they're the boss in that area, is what we're getting from this inscription. So Israel's already conquered and established themselves by this time. That's why he mentions them as the people in the land of Canaan. And he says he destroyed all their grain, basically. What can we link this to? There might be a passage in Judges that talks about this, but it's unclear. But this definitely shows the Israelites already established in Canaan in the 13th century BC after they've conquered. Now, what about the specific evidence of the conquest? And I like to look at 4 key cities here: Jericho, Ai, Hatzor, and Shechem. So Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor were all destroyed by fire, specifically noted as so in the text. And Shechem, however, was a different situation. It wasn't destroyed. It's unique, and it's worth noting because it has some different evidence relating to that. But we see in Joshua 6, Jericho was tightly shut because of the sons of Israel. No one came out, no one came in. All right, it was this big walled city. Here's a photo from the very early excavations there. And you can actually see a man right there. So see how big that wall is? This is the stone retaining wall. Now above that, this is the mud brick city wall, of which if you follow it around, you see it's fallen down all over here. There's one section where part of it was preserved, but basically everywhere else, it fell down. And we'll look at that and the connection to the story. But first, what about the destruction of Jericho? There's a specific term in Hebrew, it's harem, but we see in Joshua 6 translation, the city shall be devoted to destruction. It and all that is in it belongs to Yahweh. So they were supposed to destroy this stuff. Only keep for yourselves from the things under the ban. So they're not supposed to loot the city, which is uncommon practice for conquering cities in the ancient world. The armies would go take everything of value. But what happened is they excavate at Jericho and they find again and again all these massive storage jars full of grain because the city got destroyed soon after harvest. Well, we see that from the timeline in the book of Joshua, chapters 2, 3, and 5. So we would expect that it was after harvest, and that's what this shows. It also shows that the people who destroyed the city did not loot the city. They left it. They burned it like a sacrifice. It was devoted to destruction. And this is not what we would find normally. This is not what a military would do. They would actually besiege a city before harvest so they could, 1, starve out the people inside the city, and 2, feed their own army from the fields when the harvest was ready. But here, they pick the worst time, and then they don't even take the food. They burn it. That wouldn't go over well with most of your armies, but if they have this divine command to devote it to destruction, that explains why. It fits quite well with the narrative. In fact, this same practice was found recently in excavations at Hatzor, and so it's something that probably happened at quite a few cities that the Israelites destroyed. We just get the full details about it at Jericho in the Joshua narrative. What about the walls falling and the burning of the city? So this is something that is not debated amongst archaeologists. It's very clear that the walls of Jericho fell down and then the city was completely burned. You can see on the top there some of the black ash from the burning of the city and the mud bricks. This is the stone retaining wall. Now this has all been cleared out, but here actually you can see this ramp. All right, so here's the ramp. Stone retaining wall, city wall was up here, the mud brick. It fell down on itself, rolled down with gravity in front, and it basically formed this ramp so that the Israelites could walk up into the city. Every man straight ahead took the city. They burned the city with fire. So it fits exactly how it's described in Joshua. So really the issue then had become, when did this happen? And one archaeologist in particular was instrumental in sort of shifting the narrative and saying that Jericho was destroyed long before the Israelites would have been there, saying that it happened in 1550 BC, so there was no city for Joshua and the Israelites to conquer. But if we really look at the details of what was excavated there, it shows that it was destroyed right about 1400 BC. And in fact, this is what an earlier archaeologist who did a ton of work there determined too. So a couple of main lines of evidence, won't get too into these, but the pottery from Jericho, not just their local sort of everyday pottery, but also what we might call exotic in pottery. Some of it was imported, some of it was counterfeit or imitation. This Cypriot pottery, you see the different colors there, the blue and the red, that's called bichrome, and then there's also this brownish and white, it's called chocolate on white, and you put all that together and it essentially restricts the final phase of the city from 1500 to 1400 BC, so right in that time frame. But then if we look at the Egyptian scarabs, the royal scarabs that have been recovered from Jericho, we see when the last king that's attested there, and when his reign was, we see it's right at 1400 BC when that city ceased to be occupied. So that would be the destruction. There's almost a continuous sequence of these Egyptian royal scarabs for 300 plus years. And then the last one that is found is Amenhotep III. Amenhotep III ruled from a little bit before 1400 BC to some decades after that. So he is actually the pharaoh we would expect to find as the last one attested at Jericho if it was destroyed in 1400 BC at the time of Joshua. And that's what we see. That's his scarab right there. And he was not a famously well-regarded king who had all sorts of military exploits. So it's not one they were going to make later on. But the fact is, there's no later material for that city. So that pretty much seals it as being destroyed 1400 BC, time of Joshua, in the same manner that is described in the book of Joshua. Then we get to Ai, and this is the archaeological site of Et Tel. This was quite a large city. It's actually bigger than Jericho. And here's a drone photo of it, so you can see it's on a mound, on a hill, and there's this wall that goes all the way around it. This is one that's criticized also. It's actually criticized worse than Jericho in many ways. We don't have time to get into all those details, but basically what's happened there with the excavations. Here's a map of the city. Early surveys found pottery from the time of Abraham and Joshua. Now, Ai is mentioned in context of Abraham in the book of Genesis. the first excavation there, he found this material from the time of Joshua, and he thought it fit fine. The next excavation, they said it wasn't occupied at the time of Joshua, but there's actually material they found from that time. The next excavation, same thing. They said it wasn't occupied at the time of Joshua, but the fact is they found pottery from the time of Joshua. Clear evidence of a battle. At our excavations there recently, we found a lot of sling stones. But even more importantly is the final Bronze Age city was completely torched. You can find layers of ash all over in the excavations. Desecration of the pagan temple, especially the Acropolis temple here, but there's another one here. Citadel Gate complex was buried under a massive pile of stones, which I think probably connects to Joshua 8:28 and 29, when they buried the king of Ai under a massive pile of stones at the city gate. And this is what it looked like when they went there to excavate. Big, huge pile of stones. They thought it was like some massive tower that had fallen down, but that's not what fallen towers would look like. It was an intentional burying. And then you can see, after it was uncovered, there was this gate complex, it's Citadel Gate, similar to the Bronze Age gate at Megiddo, where it kind of turns. So this was some gate complex on the western side of the city. And that's in association with the final destruction of this Canaanite city. So that seems to connect pretty well to Joshua. Beit Aven, we won't get into that, but it's mentioned briefly in Joshua 7:2. We might have discovered that. And then Hatzor, finally. That's the last one that's destroyed. This one isn't really debated. It's just the 1400 BC destruction isn't talked about much. But it's very clear. Fire destruction over that whole city. Destruction of temples. Desecration of statues. The room of large storage jars that, like I referenced earlier, similar to Jericho. Here's what they did to some of the statues. Go to Deuteronomy 12:3 is just one instance where this is commanded, but it says, cut down the idols of their gods and wipe out their names from those places. Well, they chopped the heads off of all these Canaanite and Egyptian gods and kings. This is not what other Canaanites or Egyptians would have done to their own gods. So that's pretty powerful evidence that it was the Israelites involved there. Finally, Shechem. This is the peaceful assembly. Now, Shechem first pops up in Joshua 8:33 through 35. Look what I've highlighted there in bold. Now, this chapter does not say Shechem, but it tells us that they're there because it says, half of them stood in front of Mount Gerizim and half of them in front of Mount Ebal. Here's Mount Ebal, here's Mount Gerizim. Half are standing right there, half are standing right there. Shechem is in the middle of those two mountains, so we know that that's where they are. But what's really strange is there's no narrative about them conquering Shechem. And if you go to chapter 12, it lists 31 cities and kings that they defeat and destroy, and Shechem is not in there. So the Israelites didn't attack Shechem. You go to Joshua 24, they're there again. This time it does actually mention Shechem specifically. It says the name of the city. And this is where Joshua reads the law. He gathers all the tribes there. And it talks about, in both instances, it's not just Israelites, it's also the native of the land. So there's apparently some people from Shechem who were gathering with them peacefully and listening to the law. What happened there? We can only speculate, but there is evidence indicating what happened there is that it was a peaceful giving of the land. And that is because the Amarna letters, again, talk about the transference of the land of Shechem to the Habaru. He is this king, Labayu was the king of Shechem. He's criticized by other Canaanites, and so are his sons. And they're writing to the Egyptian Pharaoh, and they say, are we to act like Labayu when he was giving the land of Shachmu or Shechem to the Habaru? And then in another letter it says, Milkilu and the sons of Labayu have given the land to the king to the Habaru. So these guys are getting criticized by the other Canaanites for giving their city-state and land over to the Habaru, these invaders. So it seems, we don't know why this happened, because that's not explained, but it seems that it was just a peaceful transition. Gibeon, we have the narrative of Gibeon and Joshua. They trick them into the treaty, right? But this seems to be something else. Maybe it's because of the connection that the Israelites had to Shechem. If we go back in time, Jacob lived there, right? So I don't know if they had some relatives there. I don't know if they had a treaty, whatever. But somehow it's peacefully transferred, and that's what we see indicated in Joshua, and that's what we see in the Amarna letters. And archaeologically, there's no destruction of Shechem anywhere around the time of Joshua. So that's an important one that does not get destroyed. And then, of course, there's this meeting, and Joshua challenges the nation to serve God. Finally, the last little thing I'll mention is the population growth actually indicates a conquest of Canaan and then a new people entering. It shows that they have fairly consistent population growth, and then suddenly around the time of the conquest, it drops, and there's a lot of cities that are abandoned or destroyed, and then there are a bunch of new settlements that come up, and that's exactly what you would expect from reading Joshua, is a nation comes in, they destroy a bunch of places, the population drops, but they start establishing new cities too, and then the population starts growing again. So even from a sort of 35,000 feet perspective, archaeologically, we see that the evidence fits the Joshua narrative. We won't get into the population data, but just an overview then. Jericho, destroyed and burned about 1400 BC. Hatzor, destroyed and burned about 1400 BC. Ai, destroyed by fire and abandoned also about 1400 BC, most likely. Shechem, not destroyed, given to the Habaru about 1400 BC. Plenty of documentary evidence from this period, the late Bronze Age, mentioning the Israelites in Canaan and then becoming the primary people of that region, and then this population shift. So we have a lot of strong information that confirms the reliability of the book of Joshua. And of course, what was the reason for them getting rid of these Canaanites? We looked at some of the evil practices in Canaanite religion and culture, and what was that going to do if they didn't get rid of them? Well, they were going to be influenced by that. There was going to be cultural and religious syncretism, and that's exactly what we see in the next period in the book of Judges. And there's this terrible cycle that they go through. They get influenced by paganism, then they adopt some of those practices. Here's what we see with syncretism. And then they're punished through this oppression from these foreign kings and powers. Then they finally, it's bad, God help us. And then God raises up a judge and delivers them. Unfortunately, these cycles repeat in the book of Judges. That could have been avoided if everything had been done according to plan, but again, they didn't quite get rid of all of the Canaanite influence there. That speech that Joshua gives, he says in chapter 23, verses 6 through 8, he says, "Be very firm then to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, so that you may not turn aside from it to the right hand or to the left, so that you will not associate with these nations, these which remain among you, or profess the name of their gods, or make anyone swear by them, or serve them, or bow down to them. But you are to cling to Yahweh your God, as you have done to this day." So he's basically telling them, be faithful and don't wander to these other gods. Unfortunately, that's what happened for some of the people soon after. Joshua also says in chapter 24, "Revere Yahweh and serve him in sincerity and faithfulness. Remove the gods that your ancestors served. As for me and my household, we will serve Yahweh." And these are principles that we can apply to today. He's not just saying follow the ritual law. There's many moral, spiritual things within the law of Moses that apply universally, and of course the concepts of faithfulness to God. And so we see not doing this, spiritual compromise, spiritual syncretism, is going to damage our spiritual faith and even our physical or temporary life on earth. Joshua 23 and 24 that we looked at, he's talking about that, but that's exhibited in Judges. We have examples in Exodus and Genesis. It's also very apparent in the New Testament. Hebrews 6, Ephesians 4, 17 through 20, Galatians 4, 9 through 31, 1 Corinthians 10, 14 through 22. You can look at those on your own later. We see the concept in Ephesians 6 that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the spiritual forces. Well, Joshua's telling them the same thing here. It's just in that time period, it was more in your face because people didn't discount the existence of the supernatural. But he's still telling them the main thing here is spiritual, and it's clinging to God and rejecting this false spirituality, these false gods. And that was going to, these principles was going to make them spiritually healthy. And so what Joshua tells them to do, to learn all that is written in the book, learn the Word of God, and act on it and apply it. And this is something we see throughout both Old and New Testament. And it's not just something that we look in the context of the time of Joshua, but it continues today and will continue to do so. So let's close in prayer, and then Pastor Jeremy's going to close out for you. Father, thank you that you've left so much evidence behind demonstrating the truth of your word. Thank you also that even these things were written 3,400 years ago still apply to us today. We can learn lessons from them. We learn your word. We apply your word. We stay true to you. In Christ's name, amen.
Okay, good. I hope you enjoyed that. I'm super excited. Those last slides are just kind of, revving us up for exactly the doctrine that we're going to cover when we get to the Conquest. So if you can guess the doctrine, I won't give you $100 or anything, but it'll be basically the doctrine of sanctification, where we deal with the aim of sanctification, the means, how we're sanctified, the dimensions, and of course the enemies. And that's the great picture of the Conquest is the enemies that were in the land that God had given the people of Israel as he begins to outwork his Abrahamic covenant with them and give them the land. So we also have enemies in the Christian life, which was mentioned in Ephesians 6 and other passages. So that's just a super awesome period of history to depict, really in a very concrete way, the fact we're in a spiritual warfare. And if we can put ourselves in the shoes of the Israelites as they go in to conquest at Joshua and Ai and all these places, then we get a feel for the real struggle and obstacles we have to overcome. So thank you, Titus. It's awesome. I always love archaeology. It connects our faith to real history, and that's where we live the Christian life. This is a real history. You're all living it. So Tato, if you can come forward, we're going to close out with a song, and then I'll be back next week, and we'll cover the end of Mount Sinai, and then press on to the Conquest.
Riven, do you want the slides, or do you just want to do the... If you're interested in using your hymnal, that's 537. We are singing Hark the Herald Angels Sing.
Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King. Peace on earth and mercy mild, God and sinners reconciled. Joyful all ye nations rise, Join the triumph of the skies, with the angelic host proclaim, Christ is born in Bethlehem. Hark, the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King. Christ by highest have adored, Christ the everlasting Lord. Late in time, behold him come, offspring of the Virgin's womb. Veiled in flesh the Godhead see, hailed incarnate deity.